everyone. Thank you for coming. So with an interdisciplinary field like legal anthropology, conversations about balancing different methodological approaches are important in managing the opportunities and challenges of both legal research strategies as well as ethnographic methodologies, and also to address the needs of vulnerable affinity spaces. And sociolegal research into urban social spaces must increasingly account for the tight-knit communities and networks grown online on social media platforms that mirror, supplement, and even replace physical presence within a community's central physical gathering space. Failing to acknowledge the virtual aspect of communities built out of connections to meaningful cultural and community spaces in the city make it impossible to gain a holistic and more complete understanding of a cultural space and its practicing community, or what can be characterized as a mixed virtual and physical affinity space in the city. And this is especially important in light of the many intersections between the virtual and the physical, where globally accessible online affinity spaces built purely online have been successful in organizing and instigating attacks on physical gathering spaces through the harnessing of local legal frameworks, such as recent hate campaigns carried out on 4chan's politically incorrect board. There, hate campaigns to shut down DIY or do-it-yourself community gathering spaces ranging across the United States and Canada through what I've termed elsewhere building code Vigilantism, have exploited sanctioned municipal laws and LGBTQ-friendly spaces for the purposes of forcing them to close and displacing the attending community. Supplementing an institutional ethnography approach with a mapping of these virtual actions when measured against a physical mapping of their effects enables an understanding of the impacts communities can have on each other. And in looking at the geography of these networks and communities with online and offline aspects, an urban application of legal anthropology must be flexible in research method design in the interest of pursuing justice for vulnerable communities. A helpful way to understand them, to study them, and to create appropriate legislation and effective strategies for municipal legal protection and enforcement is by viewing them as a mixed virtual and physical affinity space and spending time in these affinity spaces learning and observing and tracking. So first of all, my focus in terms of types of mixed virtual and physical affinity spaces is on DIY spaces of independent and often countercultural arts production, consumption, and community. Many of these spaces are also living spaces, either for a number of people or the individuals who operate the venue. And this is part of what makes them sustainable for the venue operator, but also impose a whole host of legal challenges. So in terms of why to approach these grassroots independent arts and performance spaces through the lens of affinity spaces rather than another lens, such as practicing communities or communities of practice, is that it enables the displacement of a lot of what is imported when talking about a specific group of people. So like the centrality of participation, membership, boundaries, and so on. And do so in order to focus on the space itself and the municipal legal frameworks and processes such as municipal bylaws, codes, enforcement, heritage legislation, property taxes, the kinds of things that ultimately shape the existence of a space. So what are affinity spaces? So these are spaces that can be characterized by a common endeavor, which is central and transcends gender, race, class, disability, and level of participation in terms of how people relate to each other. There is a sharing of intensive or specialized and extensive and less specialized knowledge that is encouraged, and this enables many to have something special to contribute within the space. There's an encouragement of different kinds of knowledge, individual, distributed, dispersed, tacit, and so on. And there are different forms, levels, and routes to participation and status, which are fluid over time. Leadership is porous and flexible, and leaders are viewed as resources. And these spaces can also be a mixture of the virtual and the physical. So now here's an example of the interplay of the virtual and the physical, and some background about the specific project that I'm working on today. On the evening of December 2nd, 2016, one of the deadliest fires in California's history ripped through the ghost ship, a labyrinthine, dilapidated two-story warehouse in Oakland, California, which was home to a live-work DIY community and a countercultural arts collective and gathering space. The ghost ship occupied a two-story building along a populated street, close to the tent city beneath the overpass leading to the Oakland Bridge. It was a space for underground music, experimental performance, and artists facing numerous socioeconomic barriers to securing safe living, performance, and gathering space. 36 people died in that fire, and at the time of the fire, a pop-up electronic dance music concert thrown by a small touring record label was taking place on the second floor of the ghost ship. And the majority of those killed were attending this event. In the aftermath of the fire, many were astounded as to how a disaster of this magnitude could have occurred in a populated commercial and residential zone in the middle of a major U.S. city. What could have been done differently, both in terms of the safety of the building itself as well as the safety of the events taking place in the space? How had this building existed in flagrant violation of applicable fire safety and building codes? And why were local authorities entirely ineffective in preventing the tragedy? And part of the answer is what makes spaces like Ghost Ship socially and economically accessible as transgressive and alternative gathering spaces is their very existence outside of municipal norms and the legal frameworks governing buildings and spaces in the city. Their existence as spaces that are not up to code and the secrecy of their existence provides a measure of invisibility for those who find themselves targets of intolerance. These often unregulated, unlicensed community gathering spaces and events void of the requisite permits are also usually LGBTQ-friendly spaces that provide a safe social space for the marginal and for the transgressive and welcome communities, individuals, and outsiders who may be unwelcome, excluded, and targeted elsewhere in the city. But the safe community space that these venues provide can also be precarious, both in their ability to remain in existence and escape displacement, but also in terms of physical safety, where these unregulated, unlicensed spaces like Ghost Ship can also be characterized by what municipal building codes and zoning restrictions and fire regulations deem as structurally less safe, disorderly, and in contravention of the bylaws and regulations governing use that are enforced in the city. The Ghost Ship is just one example among its counterparts in most North American cities, Canadian cities, including Toronto and Vancouver. And this reveals the complicated disconnect that exists between different factions of the city, of the various competing interests engaged in city planning and redevelopment strategies, and the municipal legal frameworks that and governance that has to bind all this together. But municipal legal frameworks that, at least in theory, exist to protect all citizens, but tend to provide better representation to people who fall into normative categories of those who tend to follow zoning bylaws, noise bylaws, and what is generally deemed as orderly spatiotemporal property use that poses no visual or auditory offense at inconvenient times of the day or night. And so my focus within this, however, is on the physical displacement of these affinity spaces due to, as I mentioned before, building code vigilantism. And this has stemmed from virtual attacks orchestrated by other affinity spaces and the long-term reactions and effects this has had on DIY affinity spaces all over the US and Canada, such as was the case with Soy Bomb, which was forced to close on account of this at the beginning of last year. So what is building code vigilantism? It's orchestrated by alt-right online white supremacist groups who call themselves right-wing safety squads on forums like 4chan or Reddit's The Donald Forum. And what do these groups do? So members of these anonymous internet groups have declared war on DIYs. They see them as spawning grounds for radical leftist ideas that they see to be threatening to their view of America's freedom. And they have been relying on the Ghost Ship tragedy as a cover for their cause. So 4chan users have been contacting local authorities in cities across North America, including Toronto and Vancouver, in order to report DIY spaces as safety hazards to both those attending the spaces as well as the general public. And when these spaces are inspected, they usually do have some minor code infractions, and so then they're forced to close. So essentially how this is done, there are some master how-to threads that provide instructions for DIY takedown strategies, and They do this by finding all possible building and fire code violations and reporting them to authorities. And they suggest who to contact, so city council, fire marshals, city building inspectors, and so on. And these posts then provide a checklist of what to report in terms of safety or code infractions. So these can be things like no sprinklers, exits that aren't clearly marked, uncovered holes in the ceilings, no smoke detectors. Then they usually list as a kind of badge of honor the venues they've successfully been able to shut down since the ghost ship. A common term that pops up in these threads that you can see here is LGBT BBQ or barbecue. So here's another thread. You can see Pepe the Frog up there in the left-hand corner engulfed in flames. And if you read through the comments in the thread, there is what you could describe as a morbid glee among those posting that they've discovered a method of communicating what they really feel within an authorized legal discourse. Still other posts explain that those wishing to take down a DIY space don't even need to visit the space physically, but they can just look online, on YouTube, for example, and search for past events and then from there identify potential safety code violations in the videos, report those. And this is what appears to have happened to one of Toronto's DIY mainstays, Soy Bomb. So Soy Bomb was one of Toronto's longest running DIY spaces, in operation since 2003. It originally opened as a space for skateboarding, featured a half pipe, but then eventually started holding more music events, and the half pipe became a stage space. So here, Soy Bomb pops up on 4chan. You can see the triple brackets or the echoing, which has been shifted from anti-Semitic use to anti-LGBTQ use. And here it indicates the space being targeted as an LGBTQ-friendly space. And then Soy Bomb ultimately ceased operating as a venue not long after this post. So, the freshness of the resource of social media platforms and mixed virtual and physical affinity spaces in studying social life may be seen by a novelty as some, or maybe seen as lacking in quantifiable legitimacy. But these don't actually confront ethnographers with never-seen-before challenges for which they don't already have the requisite tools and don't already face in the offline context. Qualitative ethnographic methodology already requires paying attention to detail through observation, immersion into a diversity of lived lives through participation, systematic modes of questioning, through interviewing, and epistemologies for working with text, images, film, and other media representations of the self and other. And virtual ethnographic techniques are themselves also nothing new for examining the internet as an object within people's lives and as a site where community-like formations are achieved and sustained in the ways in which it's used, interpreted, and reinterpreted. And while many scholars have been using social media as a research tool and writing about its methodological relevance, especially in the field of anthropology and as I continue to encounter in the fields of law and legal anthropology, there is still much need for discussions about fieldwork engaging with fluid and interactive online and offline social media platforms and within the context of these mixed virtual and physical affinity spaces, where there is a wealth of and quality of data generated that's directly applicable to how life in the city is shaped and governed. And as just one example of challenges and opportunities specific to this kind of interdisciplinary work and publishing in particular, where rigorous citation practices are an important part of publishing in traditional legal periodicals. Since texts are still involved in the analysis of case sites, this imports a host of citation concerns that in-person participant observation wouldn't usually require in terms of reader access. But at the same time, this provides an opportunity for a rigorous and methodical tracking of sources and observation for potential reader replication and verification in a way that isn't usually as possible with physical encounters and participant observation. And one great benefit of this is the transparency it provides and the way in which, if they're interested, those accessing the research are invited to track and replicate the processes and experience of how the ethnographic data was collected through the available citations to virtual but accessible affinity spaces as research sites. But on the other hand, there is also the potential creation of another vulnerability where the virtual information of affinity spaces that might otherwise remain unknown is made available for appropriation and discriminatory attacks, which is what we saw with DIY communities when they came onto the radar of alt-right white supremacist groups in the wake of the Ghost Ship fire. Thank you.